welcome everyone. My name is Herman Chique-Alfonzo, and I'm the Education and Program Coordinator for the Dementia Society of Ottawa and Brantford County. We recognize the importance of brain health and dementia prevention. According to Dementia Prevention, Intervention and Care 2020 report of the Lancet Commission, modifying 12 risk factors might prevent or delay up to 40% of dementia. In that note, this live webinar will help us to understand and to solve the question, can alcohol consumption increase dementia risk? We're very pleased to introduce our speaker today. He's Dr. Andrew Frank. He's a neurologist at the Bruyère Memory Program, Bruyère Hospital. And if you have any question, you can type it in the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be at the very end of this presentation. So without further ado, I will turn over to Dr. Andrew Frank.
Thank you, Herman. Thank you, Grace, as well. And welcome, everyone. And I hope to provide a presentation which you find interesting and stimulating. And certainly there'll be time at the end for questions. The topic, as you can see, is alcohol and its impact on dementia risk. Really, broadly, it's the impact of alcohol on the brain, because alcohol can affect the entire body. And alcohol can be very destructive, as we know, as it is a substance of abuse and addiction. And so let's consider all of these factors in what I've put together as a brief presentation tonight. This is the chemical structure of alcohol that we know of, which is really ethanol, because there are many different kinds of alcohol in chemistry. But ethanol is the alcohol that we consume, and it's a very small molecule, as you can see, with some carbon and hydrogen atoms and one oxygen there. It's very small, not that much bigger than water itself, and yet it's very powerful despite being so small. In the brain, it acts as a relatively potent inhibitor of the brain, by which I mean it decreases stimulation. It decreases excitement. So it's a kind of sedative, really, in that it acts on a neurotransmitter called GABA. GABA is an acronym for gamma-aminobutyric acid. And GABA is one of the many different kinds of neurotransmitters in the brain, which carries messages from one brain cell to another. And we have billions of brain cells communicating with each other with transmitters. You've probably heard of other ones like serotonin and dopamine. And one of them is GABA, which is the inhibiting transmitter. And that sort of decreases the excitement in the brain and stops signaling, slows signaling, which is very important because the brain can become overstimulated, and in a worst case scenario can become epileptic, in which a seizure causes uncontrolled electrical disturbance in the brain. That would be what would happen if there was no inhibition, if there was no calming of transmission. The brain would essentially go out of control. So GABA is very important, and alcohol acts as a stimulant, or acts in place of GABA to decrease stimulation. So it works alongside GABA to slow the brain down, as we all sort of know, because alcohol causes relaxation, maybe social fluidity and confidence, and even pleasure, which is why the consumption of alcohol has been part of human history for over 10,000 years, it's believed, based on archaeological digs. Humans have been trying to harness the power of fermentation, which is the creation of ethanol from sugar, for it's over nearly 10,000 years of our history. For this purpose, however, if more is taken, it may cause negative effects, as we well know. Initially, decreased reaction time, decreased judgment, and more so, decreased movement ability, such that we the brain will begin, as it becomes sedated, slurred in its speech and blurred in its vision and becoming off balance in walking. And importantly, it can decrease memory, creating blackouts almost, as if there are parts of memory which are no longer recalled later on. If alcohol is consumed to such a point that such a concentration is reached in the bloodstream and therefore in the brain, the areas of the brain that create memory, the hippocampus, becomes sedated essentially, or inhibited, slowed, and new memories will simply not be made. So there may be periods of time that later cannot be recalled. If intake is even higher, and I believe all of us know this instinctively, if the concentration reaches such a level that there is so much inhibition that the brain itself will become confused or delirious, such that one will not know exactly where they are or even who they are. And coma is essentially a sleep state from which one is not waking up, all possible in the setting of acute alcohol poisoning, and even death, because if enough alcohol inhibits the breathing centers of the brain, then spontaneous breathing will not occur, which will lead, of course, to death. So a serious compound and chemical in our lives, and it, of course, falls upon us to use responsibly. I want to transition to what alcohol can do to the brain most strikingly. Because as we know, it can affect the liver. It can also affect the heart. But how does it affect the brain? Well, aside from these acute inhibition effects that I just described, very importantly, alcohol induces vitamin deficiency. I don't believe it's fully understood why, but as I've listed here at the bottom, it's believed that, well, if there's a lot of alcohol intake, that might decrease the need for calories or energy elsewhere, so there'll be poor nutrition as the bulk of nutrition is taken in through an alcoholic beverage with very little nutritional value. Other forms of intake, other forms of food are not taken in, so the nutrition falls. That can cause vitamin deficiency of many different types. But also it's believed that perhaps the alcohol can also inflame the stomach itself, causing the decreased ability to absorb vitamins of many different kinds. The most important vitamin that alcohol seems to block in its absorption is thiamine, also known as vitamin B1. The vitamin B complex involves many different vitamins, as you know, B1, B2, which is riboflavin, B3 is niacin, B6, and B12, all part of this water-soluble B complex. But B1, thiamine, is a very important essential nutrient. It's something our body cannot make on its own. So it must be eaten on a regularity to resupply, because thiamine is essential for creating energy out of food. If we are to take in glucose, which is our basic food, the only way to turn that glucose into energy that the body and brain can use to do all life functions, it requires thiamine every single time. To get glucose, which is a larger molecule, down to much smaller molecules, and then into the mitochondria of cells where energy, known as ATP, is made. And that ATP is how the cells do everything from making its own skeleton and its own proteins, and all of its functioning, all of its life is through glucose to ATP, and thiamine is right there in the middle, allowing that to happen, without which the system will break down. So you can imagine that alcohol, when taken chronically, may not necessarily create that sedation that I talked about, but over time, if it prevents thiamine from getting into the body, then the brain will start to be in a chronic state of decreased energy, and that can cause damage. And in its acute form, when it reaches a point that there is far too little thiamine, we get what is called Wernickesencephalopathy, which is a sudden onset of inability to move the eyes, maintain balance with confusion. Now, a lot of this sounds like alcohol intoxication, but in this case, it's not the case. There has been no excessive alcohol intake, just an ongoing chronic heavy alcohol use over years, which leads to a thiamine deficiency and this sudden onset, which can present to the emergency room as intoxication. But if a physician is very attuned, then this thiamine deficiency, if a history of chronic alcohol use is brought out, then it can be treated with a thiamine injection, which reverses all the symptoms. So all this to say is that there is both acute or sudden alcohol poisoning, which I described before, but there is also a chronic alcohol poisoning, which is mediated through thiamine deficiency. And if the Wernickesencephalopathy is not treated, or there is a longer, even longer period of vitamin B1 deficiency, we get what is called Korsakoff syndrome. Korsakoff syndrome is, again, a chronic, often alcohol-associated thiamine deficiency state of the brain, in which there is a gradual development of short-term and long-term memory deficit. And that sounds a lot like Alzheimer's, which is the condition that I work most commonly with. But this can be developed right out of chronic, heavy alcohol use, in which thiamine is blocked from getting into the body. Another feature of the Korsakoff alcoholic syndrome is confabulation, in which individuals will invent new memories that seem very real to the individual and are not a conscious lie at all, but rather an invented memory that seems fully real to the individual, associated with significant short-term and long-term memory deficits, developing over 1 or 2 years in the context of chronic alcohol abuse, with lack of insight into the memory loss, as I mentioned, and empty conversation and apathy, that is almost a loss of emotions, known as the Korsakoff syndrome, not due to Alzheimer's disease, which is the much more common type of dementia, but rather due to alcohol-induced chronic thiamine deficiency. So I'm describing acute alcohol intoxication as well as chronic thiamine-induced intoxication, all to set up this idea that the alcohol itself can be poisonous to the brain in overly inhibiting or slowing the brain. And the alcohol can be destructive over time by limiting access to thiamine, which is essential for energy use, creating what you can see to be as a dementia syndrome of its own, the Korsakoff syndrome. So if you were to ask me, can alcohol cause dementia? The answer is certainly yes, both acutely in its delirium, but also chronically in this vitamin B1 deficiency and the Korsakoff syndrome, which looks very much like Alzheimer's disease. The question then comes, well, how much does it take to get, well, acute intoxication? And how much does it take to have this chronic dementia-like syndrome develop? And is there a safe level of alcohol, which is, of course, a part of our society in general? The Korsakoff syndrome develops gradually and, in fact, may be permanent, even if thiamine is replaced. So how much does it take? We'll come to that in just a moment when we remind ourselves that, of course, as I mentioned, alcohol can affect other parts of the body, including the liver, as we well know, and the heart, but also the peripheral nerves, causing neuropathy, which is numbness, tingling, weakness of the muscles. And gastric, as we described, decreased vitamin absorption and pancreatic injury and pancreatitis. And if we were to stop alcohol, and I bring this up just to sort of fill out the discussion, because if someone presents to the emergency room with acute alcohol poisoning or that possible Wernickesencephalopathy from thiamine deficiency, and we try to stop the alcohol, suddenly we must remember that there are in fact withdrawal effects if someone is chronically using alcohol, known as delirium tremens, in which someone withdraws from alcohol with significant agitation and confusion, hallucinations, and tremor, hence the name tremens, which can also be managed with medication. And of course, there are community resources out there for those who are both acutely and chronically exposing themselves to too much alcohol. So, to the crux of the matter, how much does it take to become acutely intoxicated? Well, it's different for different individuals depending on how used to the effects of alcohol one is. An individual can become intoxicated with just 1 or 2 drinks if they've never been exposed before, but may take 6 or 7 or 8 drinks in a day to become acutely intoxicated. But what about chronic use? And that's, I think, what people really want to know is what is a safe chronic alcohol intake that does not cause thiamine deficiency and does not cause Korsakoff syndrome and does not increase risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease in general. So many studies have shown that perhaps a magic number here is 14. Greater than 14 alcoholic beverages per week is associated with increased risk of thiamine deficiency, Korsakoff syndrome, and yes, also dementia and Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to briefly later, I'll show what a standard drink is defined as, because of course there's some variability. So 14 standard drinks per week seems to be a magic number, above which there is clear risk, and below which studies have shown, and this is the interesting part, at 1 to 14 drinks per week, there is either no effect on dementia risk compared to a non-drinker, or a slightly decreased risk of dementia compared to non-drinkers. Meaning, somewhere between 1 and 14, there's either no effect on dementia risk in that it appears safe, or a slightly decreased risk of dementia compared to non-drinkers who drink 0 per week. Does that indicate that alcohol is protective against dementia in those who drink under 14 drinks per week? Let's see. Here is the most recent study I could find, which appears well done and published in a reputable journal, the JAMA Journal of American Medical Association, in 2019. This is a group of over 3,000 individuals with a median age or middle age sort of average of 78. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer here, but about 3,000 people, average age of 78, who were followed over an average period of 6 years. So they were categorized initially as having normal memory or mild cognitive impairment, MCI, which means a mild memory condition at risk for dementia in the future. There were 2,500 individuals with normal memory and about 500 individuals with mild cognitive impairment. And they were followed over 6 years on average to see how many of them developed dementia. And at the beginning, each one of them indicated what their weekly alcohol intake was. In individuals who had normal memory, this is the graph on the left, those who had 0 alcohol intake, so non-drinkers, were sort of defined as about as zero risk, so baseline zero risk. And as we increase the number of drinks per week, we can see, does the risk go up or down? The dotted line, or the hashed lines here, is the standard deviation. So it's the statistical range in which the truth of the study lies, and the dark line in the middle is pretty close to what the study is actually showing, the truth, if you will, which is somewhere near this thick line, but between the two dashed lines. And so have a look. According to this study, if individuals who did not drink were set at about a zero risk baseline for the purpose of this analysis, as the number of drinks per week increased from 5 up to 10, there was a decrease in their risk of developing dementia over 6 years that they were followed. So indicating that alcohol intake was not clearly associated with more risk as you drank more and more, but in the medium range, there appeared to be less dementia, less risk of dementia over 6 years as one drank 5 drinks per week, maybe 10 drinks per week. And only as we reach this magic number of 14 drinks per week, which of course 2 drinks per day, did it start to go above zero, or well, around this. So there was a dip. Here, in those who had memory loss, if the non-drinkers were set at 0, their risk also dipped a little bit too, maybe around 4 drinks per week. They had slightly less development of dementia, but then past 5 and 10, their risk went up dramatically as they drank more and more per week. So what do we draw from this? Greater than 14 drinks per week is simply not recommended. Greater than 2 drinks per day it is found, has a higher risk of dementia. And as I mentioned, at risk for acute alcohol intoxication and chronic thiamine deficiency with its potential development of Wernickesencephalopathy or Korsakoff's syndrome. Now, less than 14 drinks appears to be safe and possibly protective. Keep in mind that this is called associational data. That means to say that there were, the individuals had their weekly alcohol intake and their risk of dementia was shown. Those were then associated with each other. That is, their weekly alcohol intake was associated with their risk of dementia. That does not imply that the alcohol caused the dementia or that the alcohol prevented dementia. This kind of data does not tell us about cause and effect between alcohol and dementia. It just tries to associate how much is taken in and someone's risk. That does not mean that one is causing the other. That's the point I'm making. This is association data, so we can't actually say that the alcohol is directly responsible for any decreased dementia risk. So we cannot say that it is truly protective. But it appears to be safe because the risk of dementia didn't seem to skyrocket in this range. And in fact, it seemed to go down a little bit. So it is possibly protective, but we cannot prove that from this association data. So note that while it seems to be safe to drink in this range in terms of dementia risk, there is no recommendation, therefore, for non-drinkers to start drinking in order to protect themselves. That is to say, this data does not tell us that non-drinkers should start drinking in order to get a lower risk of dementia, because this is a association data. But as I mentioned, it appears safe. And so for those of us all who may enjoy alcohol on a weekly basis in this range between 1 and 14 drinks per week, it appears safe. And who knows, possibly protective There has been some discussion about the protective effects of alcohol. As you may have heard, that for many years it was thought to be perhaps a mild blood thinner, a mild antioxidant, which prevents heart attack and stroke, you may have heard, at small amounts. Maybe, just maybe, there may be some effect of alcohol on dementia in the same way, that in these small amounts, the alcohol may be possibly protective. But again, this is not a recommendation for non-drinkers to start drinking. And here is a definition of the standard drink. When we talk about this range of 1 to 14 drinks, in which perhaps, 5 to 7 drinks per week appeared to be the most effective in lowering the risk or associated with lowering the risk. So about 7 drinks per week, perhaps 1 per day of 12 fluid ounces of beer, 8 to 9 fluid ounces of malt liquor, 5 fluid ounces of wine. That is the standard glass of wine. A fluid ounce is 30 milliliters. And or 1.5 fluid ounces of liquor. At 40% alcohol, 1.5 fluid ounces is a standard drink. These are all believed to be essentially equivalent in this calculation. So again, from the data of this study I've showed you, but also previous studies, there is no, it is recommended against exceeding 14 drinks per week. Therefore, there should be no more than 1 to 2 drinks per day. Sometimes they differentiate between men and women, stating that women should not drink more than 1 drink per day, and that men should not drink more than 2, based on the differential in weight between the genders. Excessive alcohol consumption, many sources have defined it as greater than 3 to 4 drinks per day, is one definition of excessive alcohol consumption. And the definition of alcoholism itself is also contentious, but the psychiatric manual, the DSM-5, has defined alcohol use disorder as a distressing, excessive alcohol intake of greater than what is healthy, in which one cannot control consumption, leading to multiple or leading to health deterioration. So any excessive alcohol consumption which cannot be controlled, leading to health deterioration, can be deemed an alcoholism. So to conclude, alcohol intake, both immediate and chronic, causes brain toxicity through excess, sedation, and inhibition, as well as causing vitamin deficiency, especially thiamine. Heavy alcohol intake is associated with risk of Korsakoff syndrome and dementia at over 14 drinks per week. So alcohol intake itself appears safe, though should not exceed 1 to 2 drinks per day. With that, Herman, I'll send it back to you.
Right, Andrew. So thank you very much for this great presentation. So let's see if we have any question from the audience. Grace, any question for Dr. Frank?
I don't see any questions here yet, but yes, just a reminder that if you do have a question, you can go ahead and enter it into the chat box and we'll read it out for Dr. Frank. Just give it another minute here and see if anybody has a question.
No problem. No questions could mean it was a great presentation or a terrible one, and we don't have to answer that question.
Definitely a great one.
Some of this information I do appreciate might be well known to many of you. And the recommendation of 1 to 2 drinks per day might be well known already. But it's nice to see that some of the well done studies appear to corroborate or confirm this finding.
Okay, great. So I do have some questions coming in here. So the first question is, does risk decrease if one stops alcoholism?
if one is not affected by that withdrawal syndrome, then in my view, well, I guess this gets to the question of the causality. Do these studies actually prove cause and effect? And I wonder if I could reframe your question. Like if someone is, drinks 7 drinks per week and then stops drinking, does their risk for dementia go up? That's a very tough question, and I'm going to say no, because this is not a causality. So please understand that there's no recommendation for individuals who do not drink to start drinking. Now, your question, I believe, said, does stopping alcoholism? So by definition, alcoholism is a dangerous level of alcohol consumption. And does freeing oneself from alcoholism decrease dementia risk? I would say unquestionably yes, because ongoing alcoholism provides an endless supply of toxic levels of ethanol and an endless potential for thiamine deficiency is alcoholism. So if that can be alleviated, then the brain will once again start to accumulate thiamine and energy production and will have a much greater chance of returning to health and baseline risk of dementia.
Okay, great. So next question here is from Octavio, and he's wondering, is there any recommended alcohol consumption once someone has been diagnosed with MCI or dementia?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Based on this study, which is one of the very few studies that in fact looked at individuals with MCI, it's the table or graph on the right. 500 individuals with MCI diagnosed with that dementia Alzheimer's risk state known as MCI. They were followed forward for 8 years, 6 to 8 years. And so it seemed to show that after about 7, I'm looking right over here, right up 7 weeks, 7 drinks per week, then the risk shot up over the baseline. So given this, my recommendation from this study, and again, this is not a causal, it's an association data, it seems like it's better to hold back the alcohol to no more than 7 drinks per week, whereas perhaps any of the general society might use 14 drinks per week as the magic number. It would seem from this data that the magic number for mild cognitive impairment and maybe dementia and Alzheimer's should exceed no more than 7 drinks per week. But that said, if someone is developing significant memory loss and someone notices that having even 1 drink makes that person's memory get worse before their very eyes, I would try to remain free of alcohol completely. Because, of course, alcohol is a big part of people's lives and it's a great source of enjoyment. I would then keep it less than 7 per week. But if alcohol is really adding to someone's confusion in the context of mild or moderate dementia and Alzheimer's, I would try to be free of alcohol completely so as to keep memory as intact as possible.
Okay, great. You just answered multiple questions at once. Joyce is wondering, should a person with AUD supplement with vitamin B1? And if so, how long after they stop alcohol consumption?
Alcohol use disorder. Please repeat the question.
Yes, so should a person with alcohol use disorder supplement vitamin B1? And if so, for how long after they stop alcohol consumption?
That's an excellent, excellent question. Before I answer, an anecdote was that I believe in the 1970s, there was the idea to put B1 into alcohol. Why not put the very nutrient which is lost in alcoholism in the alcohol itself? Many sources believe that that measure would save a lot of individuals from brain damage. How interesting is that? But the problem is that they would be forced to put on the label that there was thiamine, which would then potentially indicate that the alcohol was nutritious, which would then create inducement for individuals to drink even more. So because they were not able to resolve this philosophical conundrum about making alcohol appear nutritious, ultimately the movement disappeared. And to this day, as you know, there is no thiamine in alcoholic beverages. So the question is, should we supplement? And the answer is, oh yes. Anyone with alcoholism should supplement their diet with a multivitamin, B complex vitamin, or thiamine itself, without question. And if any of these chronic alcoholic conditions are diagnosed, they are treated with thiamine initially in the emergency room. And there should be ongoing oral thiamine afterwards. They can be given intravenous thiamine or intramuscular thiamine in the emergency room, but then oral thiamine thereafter. I would say for weeks, if not months, in hopes of getting as much improvement in brain function following recovery. Once the recovery is completed, maybe 6 months or a year, perhaps then the thiamine can be discontinued in favor of a nutritious diet. But without question, anyone affected by alcohol should take a multivitamin and thiamine supplements, and afterwards should continue this for many months.
Great. There's a question that's somewhat related to your answer. Should anyone with dementia be tested for thiamine deficiency?
That's an amazing question, and we do not routinely test thiamine. And what we do is we ask about alcohol consumption, and we try to get an accurate answer. If we cannot get an accurate answer, and there is a suspicion of AUD, alcohol use disorder, then in those cases we recommend thiamine supplementation with a suspected history of alcoholism. But in those in which we get a history where there simply is no history of alcoholism and no history of greater than 14 drinks per week, we do not test the thiamine in the blood. We monitor alcohol consumption, but we do not test for it, nor do we prescribe the thiamine. I guess because we presume that the history we have obtained from an individual and their family is accurate. But again, if there's any aspect to the history that is suspect, then we recommend multivitamin and thiamine supplementation.
Great. And someone is wondering, somewhat related there, what does make a person more vulnerable to alcoholism? Sorry, is there a genetic risk there? Are there any other factors involved in what makes someone potentially more at risk to alcoholism?
I'm not an expert in addiction medicine, but I do believe as a neurologist that there are certainly genetic tendencies towards risk-reward experiences. And this is localized, as you may have heard, to sort of areas of the basal ganglia in which dopamine is released, creating either attenuated or accentuated reward experiences. And those who have a higher reward experience may be more likely to engage in high-risk behavior or addictive substance dependencies. And so I think that may well have some genetic component to it. So therefore, some genetic component to risk of addiction. But we must admit that it's not all genetics. It is nature, which is genetics, plus nurture, which is environment. It is always both nature plus nurture. So while there may be some genetic component, it is not all genetic component. And there's a huge part of addiction, which it results from the environment in which someone was raised and the environment and surroundings in which they find themselves today. So there is some genetics, but it's not all genetics.
Okay. We have a question here from Kalpana. She's wondering, back to your point on vitamin B1, can vitamin B1 reduce dementia risk? And do people with dementia naturally have B1 deficiencies?
The answer is no. Those with dementia usually do not have a thiamine deficiency. Thiamine deficiency truly requires some significant health problem, the most common of which is alcoholism. There are some other significant health concerns like anorexia nervosa, not eating at all, which or other forms of malnutrition. They can all cause thiamine deficiency. So one needs a significant medical problem to develop thiamine deficiency. Thiamine is in all of our grains. It is essentially, our grains are often fortified with thiamine, as well as some meat products too, but mostly grains. So thiamine is ubiquitous in a nutritious diet. So there is no thiamine deficiency in our general public or in those with dementia. And therefore, high dose B1 thiamine will not prevent dementia, nor even treat dementia, unfortunately.
Okay, great. And to that point, is there a recommended dosage of B1 per day?
I believe it's
we should be thinking?
100 milligrams per day. I am not certain. Please check with your pharmacist.
Okay, great.
Again, it's part of our diet in general. And so many individuals will very likely get sufficient thiamine on a daily basis without any vitamin or vitamin supplement. Please understand that perhaps the very best way to ingest vitamins is through whole foods. You know, we do not need to take large amounts of vitamin supplements if our diet is sound. We may still wish to take some supplements, and a multivitamin very likely would not cause harm. But please understand that thiamine is best taken through food.
Okay, great. Diane is wondering, we'll just take a couple more questions here. She's wondering if you drink water between glasses of wine, would that affect the toxicity in your brain?
I think, well, basic chemistry states that the concentration is based on the amount ingested. And when it comes to the body, the time over which it is ingested, because the liver will act to detoxify the alcohol over time. So if you take a higher volume of alcohol in a shorter amount of time, with or without the water, there will be a higher concentration. I think the water may increase the volume of the body's fluids by a little bit, but that's probably minimal compared to the actual amount of alcohol taken and the time in which that is taken. So less alcohol or spread out over a longer period of time, that's the key to modulating the concentration.
Okay, great. And I will just take 2 or 3 more questions here. So Margot was wondering what foods specifically contain thiamine?
From my research, it's mostly the grains. Again, as I mentioned, fortified grains in almost all of our foods. And there is, I believe, some in meat products as well. But it's mostly in grains. I believe also legumes, meaning beans and peas and peanuts, as well as standard grains. This is what I reviewed. Source of thiamine. And again, my belief is that it's so present in our diet that often one does not need to take supplements. Food sources of thiamine include whole grains, meat and fish, breads and cereals. I thought legumes as well, but I'll have to research that further.
Okay, wonderful. And I know you touched on this earlier with one of the first questions, but I do see a couple more here wondering, will the brain eventually repair itself or reverse signs of dementia after the cessation of alcohol consumption? So once someone stops drinking.
Excellent question. And I believe that has to do with how much alcohol has been taken, like per day or per week, for how many years that the chronic alcohol dependency has been in place. So if it's a very heavy alcohol intake over many, many years, that may cause more permanent damage from the alcohol itself and the thiamine deficiency than someone who's had a much shorter alcohol dependency with less intake. So it's highly dependent on the individual and the exposure to alcohol that they have experienced as to how much is permanent. And so that is why after these conditions are detected, the thiamine replacement begins. And of course, hopefully the rehabilitation from alcoholism begins to hopefully get someone free of alcohol, maintain the thiamine, and then see over the next 6 months to 2 years, really, how much brain function is restored in someone who has unfortunately suffered, say, Korsakoff syndrome. And that, again, can take 1 or 2 years of thiamine replacement to see how much is restored. And some of it may well be permanent. If someone is developing Alzheimer's or dementia, that in itself, that condition itself is not fully reversible itself, because it is this neurodegeneration caused by proteins in the brain. And so if that is truly developing, that may not be reversible because we don't yet have the cure for Alzheimer's. But if someone has, again, only mild cognitive changes due to alcoholism from thiamine deficiency, then there is some reversibility to that, which is unique to each person and may take up to 2 years.
Okay, well, I think we can wrap it up at that. Thank you so much, Dr. Frank, for this insightful presentation and all of your answers as well. And thank you everyone who attended. Like I mentioned in the chat, you will be able to find a recording of this presentation. It will be up shortly on our YouTube channel. So if you do want to watch it again or send it around to friends and family, please feel free to do so. And more resources are available on our website, which is www.dementiahelp.ca. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.